The Skin Man was a short Warhammer horror story written by Tim Wagner in 2022 and included in the Warhammer horror anthology Anathemas. Our story follows Marceline, a woman desperately searching for her lost husband. In order to regain what she has lost, she will need to confront the horrors that dwell in the deepest, darkest areas of Lowtown. An ancient evil, once thought pushed back by the forces of mankind, is now once again set free to prey upon the living. To save the love of her life, she will have to face the overwhelming horror of the Skin Man's domain. How far will one go, and how much are they willing to sacrifice to save the ones they love? Fans of the Warhammer 40K franchise are well aware that the Imperium of Mankind is a massive galactic-spanning empire whose kingdom contains around 1 million distinct worlds. However, the forces of mankind are spread thin, and many of those worlds end up falling between the cracks, abandoned and forgotten, forced to face the horrors of the galaxy alone. What I found so particularly endearing about this story is not just how blatantly terrifying it was, but the fact that it gives us a really good insight into what it's like living on a backwater world in the far fringes of the Imperium's territory. No matter how bad things get, no matter what cosmic horrors predate upon mankind, the various military forces of the Imperium will do all they can to protect their citizens. But what happens when a world is left to its own devices? What happens when the Imperium settles it and then all records of its existence are lost within the vast labyrinthian bureaucratic departments of the Adeptus Administratum? What happens when a group of people are forced to face the grim darkness of the far future alone? Come with me, my friends, as we settle in for another entry in the Grimdark Story Hour and listen well to the tale of the Skin Man. But before we get into it, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor.
When it comes to bad habits, sometimes the best thing to do is replace them with a good habit. Or, just take the bad out of the habit. And we're not talking about some strange warpcraft here. We're talking about the sponsor of this video, Fume. Fume looks at bad habits in a totally different way. It's an innovative, award-winning device that doesn't use any electronics, doesn't produce any vapor, and instead of harmful chemicals, Fume is completely natural and uses flavored air with all kinds of natural, delicious flavors to pick from. They've also released a whole bunch of new cores, including orange vanilla, raspberry lemon, and sparkling grapefruit, which is my personal favorite. It's fresh, cooling, and super fruity. It comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with magnets and movable parts for fidgeting. It gives your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while trying to break your habit. I'm gonna be honest with you, when Fume first reached out to me to sponsor the channel, I wasn't really sure what to expect. But I gotta be honest, I was pleasantly surprised. Stopping a bad habit is something that a lot of us tend to put off for a long time, but switching to Fume is both easy, enjoyable, and even fun. They've served over 150,000 customers and had thousands of success stories, and there's no reason you can't be one of them. So head on over to tryfume.com/weshammer or scan the QR code on the screen and use code WESHAMMER to get 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com/weshammer to save an additional 10% off your order today. Big thanks to Fume for sponsoring this video. Now back to the Grimdark.
Our tale takes place in the town of Lowtown, a humble but poor and dilapidated city, built upon the ruins of those who came before, on a nameless world abandoned for thousands of years and all but forgotten by the larger Imperium. The residents of this city tell stories that their planet is but one of 1 million such worlds, that long ago it was part of a much larger galactic empire. Their ancestors had settled it in the name of a mythical figure known only as the God Emperor, and had fought to hold back a great and terrible darkness that spilled through the cracks in reality. The ones that came before, as they are known to the people of Lowtown, had slain this evil presence and then departed once more for other worlds and other battles. The faithful of the God Emperor, who were not of the warrior caste, chose to stay behind, building great cities and infrastructure, as their services were no longer needed by their masters. Those who remained did their best to survive, but over time, it was made painfully clear that the Great Darkness had dug its roots in deep. It birthed new entities spawned from its eternal hatred that sought to dominate the population physically, mentally, and spiritually. Thus it was, and thus it still is. All of the great cities have been abandoned. Even Lowtown is not entirely safe. Large portions of it have been reclaimed by the darkness. Only the mad and truly desperate choosing to delve its forgotten sectors in a vain hope of stumbling upon something of value worth scavenging. Of those who remain here, it is only a portion that holds to the tenets of these stories. The faithful believe that they have been abandoned by their God, and only by suffering under the predation of the darkness will they eventually earn his forgiveness, and their world be once again reunited within his divine kingdom. Most believe the stories to be nothing more than folklore, as something to distract from the bleakness of existence. Though even amongst the unfaithful, none would deny a secret hope that the stories bear some merit, and that the Emperor's forces will return to save them. But until that day comes, they must be ever vigilant, wary, and watchful of the signs of the great darkness's work. Of all the tales traded within Lowtown, one stands apart from the rest. It doesn't seek to enlighten the populace of their ancient history or inspire hope in the faithful for a brighter tomorrow. It serves only as a warning of what lurks out in the dark corners of the areas deemed forbidden. Spoken in hushed tones, these tales whisper of an entity known only as the Skin Man. Now, according to ancient legends, the Skin Man had once been human and had been given the grim task of harvesting body parts from the living for transplant into wounded soldiers, as they would make better use of them, fighting in the Emperor's holy name. With every murder committed and every limb stolen by this grim harvester, a wound in his soul began to fester. And as his sanity began to split apart at the seams, so too did his soul open itself to the malign entities that dwelled in the dark corners of this world, slowly transforming him into a monstrous, tainted thing. No one knows what the Skin Man wants, how he's managed to survive for so long on his own, or what he even looks like. Some tales claim he wears a ragged cloak made of stolen skin that barely conceals the obscenity of his rotten body. The others claim he is a gangrenous, misshapen amalgamation of human parts, molded into a vaguely humanoid shape, while others still say he exists as a sentient shadow, one that whispers blasphemous promises in a half-remembered language into the minds of any that draw too close to his lair, beckoning them into his madness to never be seen again. It had been 6 days since Marceline had last seen her husband Cole, and with every passing hour, she was growing increasingly worried. It wasn't like him to disappear like this for so long. Cole spent his days scavenging the ruins of those who came before in order to provide for them and their 2 children, but the longest he had ever been gone was 24 hours. They both knew the ruins were running dry, and soon they would have nothing left to offer, and when that day came, he would need to venture further than ever before. But he had sworn to her that he would never go too deep, and the longest that he would ever be away was 3 days. In her growing desperation, she headed out into the streets in the direction of the town square, in hopes that one of the other merchants or scavengers would have heard from him. It was midday, and though the sun was shining behind a perpetual yellow haze that plagued the town, the air was cold and biting. The only thing she had to protect from its chill was a shoddy dress that at this point was comprised more of stitched-on patches than the original fabric, and a tattered shawl. The area she resided in was not exactly safe and had been plagued by thieves and gangers. She was nervous being on the street alone, but clutched a jagged piece of sharp metal in her dress pocket that she had taken from her kitchen. Despite the danger, her mind was elsewhere. Her and Cole had shared a love that had become increasingly rare in these trying times. They had been together since early childhood and wed as soon as they had come of age. She knew Cole was capable of taking care of himself, but 6 days was far too long to go without sending word. Maybe he had heard a rumor of an item of particular rarity too good to pass up, one that was located in a set of ruins further from town. Surely that was it. Surely he would be home any day now. Hell, he might be home right now, playing with their children and wondering where she was. The thought comforted her, but she knew that wasn't true. She couldn't escape the feeling that something awful had happened. She made her way to the crossroads, which served as the town's open-air market. There were people here, children playing, men and women peddling their wares, and the odd beggar or two. All were rail thin, as food was hard to come by, and none made any more noise than was necessary. Being loud attracted the notice of hungry things that dwelled within the ruins surrounding Lowtown. But even still, there was safety in numbers, and she was glad to be out of the back alleys. She approached the stall of a man named Derek Gavin, an aggressive salesman years younger than her husband, who refused to take no for an answer. She had met him several times in the past and didn't much care for him, even if he always gave Cole a fair price for the relics he recovered. If anyone had heard from her husband, it would be him. He was a traditionally handsome man, with neatly trimmed blonde hair and sharp and severe features, And although he had made it painfully obvious in the past that he had eyes for Marceline, she never found herself amongst his admirers. In truth, she found him grating, a man that wasn't used to being told no, and thus had developed a particularly off-putting narcissistic personality. He was attempting to sell a jagged and bent metal panel to a man with a red beard, pitching it as a piece that had broken off of the holy armor of one of the emperor's soldiers in the ancient times. After making the sale, his eyes drifted over in Marceline's direction, and a wicked, almost predatory smile stretched across his face.
Marceline, what a wonderful surprise! What brings you to the crossroads on such a fine day? Or dare I hope you've come specially to pay me a visit?
His voice was tinged with mockery. She ignored it and got straight to the point. Have you seen Cole?
I usually see quite a bit of him.
I mean recently.
Why? Hasn't he been home lately?
He's been gone for 6 days. It's longer than he's ever been away before.
I see. That is troubling. Do you fear some ill might have befallen him? What a stupid question. Of course you do. No man would stay away from a wife as lovely as you for any longer than absolutely necessary.
Please, if you know anything.
I haven't seen him since the last time he brought me something. A few links of copper pipe. Good quality stuff, that was.
He thought for a moment.
10 days ago, maybe? He hasn't been around since, and I've been here every day.
She felt the pit of her stomach drop. She had convinced herself that someone here would have heard something. It was a false hope, and she had been clinging to it rather than face the truth that he very likely had been hurt, or even worse.
You know, if by chance Cole doesn't return, you and your 2 little ones will need someone to look after you. I make a good living, and I would be honored to share the fruit of my labor with you, as well as my bed, of course.
You're disgusting.
I know it's somewhat unseemly for me to propose such an arrangement so soon, but life is short in Lowtown. If you want something, you have to move quickly to get it. And I want you. What will it take to close the deal?
She would have struck him, slapping that smug smile off of his face, if it hadn't been for an old woman who had approached the pair and reached out and grabbed her by the wrist.
Don't listen to this fool. He's a slave to his nether regions. They do all of the thinking for him.
This is a private conversation, Lucy.
Yes, it is. Between us.
The old woman directed her away from the stall. My thanks for the rescue.
Don't thank me. Surely it was the guiding hand of the Emperor himself who brought us together this day. I'm Lucy Shade. So, your husband is missing.
Yes, for 6 days. His name is Cole. I came to look for him because I couldn't think of anywhere else to go.
6 days. Long time to be missing in Lowtown.
Marceline had been strong up until this point, but she couldn't help it. She could feel the tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. The old woman took her by the hand and patted it gently.
Everything will be all right, one way or another. It's all part of the Emperor's grand design.
Marceline wasn't religious, but if there was an emperor and Cole's disappearance had been part of his plan, she wanted nothing to do with that bastard. The old woman tells her that she knew her husband well, that she tried to convert him to her faith many times in the past, but like so many others, he had refused. At least he had always been polite about it, unlike some others who would rather spit on her than listen to her talk. She glanced over in Derek's direction. She says that in one of their previous conversations, Cole had mentioned that he was having a spell of bad luck scavenging the usual ruins, and he got it in his head to try the Black Lanes. Marceline didn't react to the old woman's words at first. The idea was so ludicrously ridiculous, she couldn't even process it. Out of all of the places in Lowtown that had been tainted by the darkness, the Black Lanes were by far the worst. No one would ever willingly go there unless they were truly desperate. Perhaps as desperate as Cole had been. She thought back to the last time she had spoken to her husband, about how he had apologized for their meals being so meager lately, about how their daughter's medicine cost so much, but things were all going to turn around soon. He had promised her that, and that was the last time she saw him. The old woman's words struck home, and she knew exactly where her husband had gone. She tells the old woman that she doesn't know how, but her and her husband were so deeply connected that if something had happened, if he truly was gone from this world, she would know it. Whatever had happened, wherever he was, something was preventing him from coming back to her. And that's why she was going to the Black Lanes to find him. The old woman tells her that she's mad. No one willingly walked into the Skin Man's domain. But if she did go, she wished her luck. and told her to please be careful. She gave her a toothless smile.
You're a nice girl, for a godless heretic.
Marceline had never ventured inside of the Black Lanes, and no one she knew ever had, but she was intimately familiar with them. As a child, her, Cole, and the other children would dare each other to see who could get the closest to them without chickening out. Always during the day, of course, and always a few streets over from the actual entrance. Her and Cole always won. Their bond gave them an edge in the bravery department. But even still, being that close to them had a profoundly troubling effect on her. There was an extreme sense of wrongness about them, like they shouldn't exist, as if the space in reality that the Black Lanes occupied was terminally sick, like the Black Lanes themselves were a malignant growth upon the body of this world, and if given the opportunity, they would spread that sickness with malevolent sentience. The closer she would get to them, the more she could hear a sound that no one else could. It started as a low murmur, a whisper in the back of her mind, but soon it would grow into the sound of dozens of voices speaking softly, all in a language she didn't understand. She would have nightmares for weeks after the experience. They of course faded over time, but even to this day as an adult, she would wake in the middle of the night screaming and panting for breath. The vague, half-remembered images of figures cloaked in shadow quickly being forgotten each and every time she woke from one of these dreams. Now, as she approached the Black Lanes once more, she felt again that profound feeling of wrongness, of violation. She could hear the whispers as well. They were louder now, more distinct, and she was able to understand more of what they were saying. They wanted her to keep going, to step over their threshold. They were welcoming her with open arms. Although it was cold everywhere in Lowtown, it was different in the Black Lanes. Everywhere else, the frigid air would start on the outside, working its way through your skin and into your bones. But here, it was as if it was coming from deep within your core, as if her blood was turning to ice. She shivered uncontrollably and wasn't sure if it was the cold or her body trying to warn her of the danger she was approaching. Either way, nothing would stop her from finding Cole. There wasn't any boundary one had to pass to truly enter the Black Lanes, and there were no street signs to indicate where their domain began. The first signs that she had crossed their threshold were subtle. The air felt flat and dead, and with every breath, a thin layer of filth and residue coated her lungs. The plascrete pavement beneath her feet didn't feel as firm as it should be. It gave way slightly beneath her weight with each and every step, and she thought to herself that it was like walking on some gigantic beast that lay slumbering and partially buried. At first glance, the buildings here looked no different than the rest of the ones found throughout Lowtown, other than the fact that they were completely abandoned. But the more one looked at them, the more they just didn't seem to add up. Lines and angles seemed to curve and meet in odd ways, and their architecture was steeped in a foreboding atmosphere that made them difficult to focus on. Their surfaces seemed to swell rhythmically, as if they were breathing. She kept her eyes forward and continued down the path, never quite being able to shake the sensation that she was being watched, as if she was being hunted by some unseen predator. Every now and then, she would catch a quick flash of movement in her peripheral vision, and though everything in her body was telling her to look at it, to assess the threat, she never did. Until suddenly, she heard a soft scuffling behind her, and instinctively, she spun around and took out the jagged piece of metal, ready to defend herself. But the street was empty. She picked up her pace until she was almost running, and right after she did this, she heard the familiar sound of bare feet clapping against plascrete behind her. She broke into a sprint, and as she did so, she heard the sound of more footsteps coming to join her pursuer. Dark shapes darting out of alleys to join in the hunt. She was in full-blown flight now, and at one point turned to see what was chasing her. There was maybe a dozen of them, each clad in filthy rags, things that were about the size of human children, but were now hideously distorted. They had large, black, orb-like eyes and were each hairless with gray, necrotic skin. They were hungry, and they had found their next meal. With how emaciated they appeared to be, she knew that if they caught her, they wouldn't bother killing her quickly. They would most likely eat her alive. She couldn't outrun them forever. She needed a place to hide. She rounded a corner and found herself in front of a large, dilapidated building, its windows and doorways filled with shadows deeper than any she had ever seen before. She barreled through the open doorway, far more afraid of her pursuers than the darkness in front of her. But when she turned back to look at them, they had all suddenly stopped, unwilling or unable to get any closer to the building. Although their faces made it difficult to read any kind of real expression, they seemed frightened. They adopted defensive postures, their nostrils flaring wildly as they sniffed the air. And then, as if an unspoken agreement had been met, They all whirled about and fled. She was alone again and could hear their footfalls growing fainter and fainter until they ceased entirely. What was it that scared them off? Surely it hadn't been her. She might have injured a couple of them with her makeshift knife, but she had been vastly outnumbered. There was something about this place that had deeply unsettled them. She turned and looked around. It was getting late, and the light of the sun only penetrated so far into the building, but it was enough for her to make out a row of old beds, their frames rusted and their mattresses covered in mold. There was also an assortment of strange metal implements that sat rusted atop wheeled carts scattered around the room. She had never seen objects like these before and wondered what they had been used for. The floor was covered in dark stains, old blood that had soaked its way into the floorboards over the course of many years. She wanted to take a moment to catch her breath, to calm herself down after the surge of adrenaline from before, but she knew she had to keep going. If she was here by the time night fell, those creatures may return in greater numbers, and perhaps they may have been the tamest of horrors the Black Lanes had to offer. That's when she heard it, an all too familiar voice coming from behind her.
Good work. If those creatures had caught you, you'd be filling their bellies by now.
Cole? Is that you? There was no response, but a few moments later, she could hear somebody walking towards her from out of the darkness. The footsteps weren't even. It sounded like somebody with a limp, like they were dragging one of their feet across the floor. Barely any light managed to penetrate its way through the broken windows, but it was enough for her to make out a silhouette, a shadow among shadows that was drawing ever closer towards her. With every step, she was able to make out more detail. The figure was tall but lopsided, one of its shoulders raised much higher than the other. One arm was thicker and longer, and its legs were similarly mismatched. It was wrapped up in a tattered black hooded cloak that concealed its face and made it appear as if it was made of shadow. One of its hands possessed long, spidery fingers, and the other had short, stubby ones. Its skin was pallid and dry, and bones were visibly jutting out of its form in several places. That's when the smell hit her. A solid wall of disease, stink, rot, corruption, and decay struck her with almost physical force. The figure reached out a hand and drew back its hood. Its face was monstrous, an amalgamation of different parts stitched together in a grotesque mockery of the human form. Nothing about its features made sense. Its lips didn't match. One ear was larger than the other. The jaw was set at an odd angle, and its teeth had been reversed, molars in the front, incisors and canines at the back. It was bald and covered in jagged scar tissue and seam lines, making it resemble a quilt of human flesh. Some of its pieces seemed new, as if recently added to its horrible form, while others had decayed so badly they were sawing off at the bone. And to her absolute horror, many of the other parts that made up this figure resembled her husband. She found herself frozen in place. The creature regarded her with its mismatched eyes, one of them bright blue, much like Cole's.
Do you know who I am, child?
It spoke in Cole's voice, but it was wrong, like a corpse mimicking the words of a loved one.
Has it been so long that no one remembers the stories about me? Have those who remain forgotten the great service I did for this world?
You're the Skin Man.
So I am remembered. This pleases me.
It took a step towards her.
Why have you come to the Black Lanes, child? Are you so weary of life that you seek to end it? Do you think so little of your own soul that you're willing to risk it so carelessly?
My husband is a scavenger. He came here 6 days ago in search of rare items to sell. He did not return, and so I came looking for him.
You are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. You must love your husband deeply to put yourself in so much danger to find him.
I do.
And what would you give to have him return to you? What would you sacrifice?
She didn't hesitate. Anything. The Skin Man drew in a sharp breath and released it slowly.
As you see, I have encountered your husband. He is now part of me. Or perhaps I should say, parts of me. But I may be able to arrange his return to you. Would this be something you desire?
Yes.
Then give me your left hand.
She hesitated at first, but then extended her arm. The Skin Man was on her in an instant. It wrapped its skeletal fingers around her wrist, and with a wet, crunching sound, it wrenched her hand free. She had never experienced such pain in her life, and she let loose a high-pitched scream of agony. Blood gushed from the ragged stump, and she watched as the rotting, stubby left hand of the Skin Man crumbled away to dust, and fleshy tendrils extruded from it, wrapping around the hand and pulling it tight against its arm, fusing it to him, leaving behind only a bloodless scar. He flexed his fingers admiringly.
I think it suits me, don't you?
He gestured across the room with his new hand to a metal barrel that suddenly burst to life with a yellow and orange flame. He told her to cauterize the wound quickly or she would bleed out. Although the shock of what had just happened left her momentarily stunned, the idea of this creature picking over her remains after she died spurred her to action. She shoved her bleeding stump into the fire and gritted her teeth as the flames seared her flesh, and right as she felt she couldn't take any more pain, she mercifully lost consciousness. She woke sometime later in the street, unaware of where she was or what had happened, everything in the Black Lanes feeling like a distant bad dream, until she looked down and saw the charred flesh where her hand used to be, and it all came rushing back. With her right hand, she braced herself and got to her feet. There were no signs of the Skin Man, and it had grown dark. She couldn't tell exactly where she was, but she was sure she was no longer in the Black Lanes themselves, and most likely was right on their outskirts. Had she walked here herself, or had the Skin Man taken her here? She didn't know, and the confusion unnerved her. It was just then that she heard the Skin Man's voice in her mind, telling her that the sacrifice was to prove the seriousness of her intentions, and that if she wished to restore her husband to life, she would require new parts to replace those he had taken from Cole. The implication was clear. In order to get her husband back from this creature, she would have to become a murderer. She would need to barter with goods of equal value. She had said she would do anything, that she would sacrifice anything to see her husband again. But this, it was too much. It was then that she heard a man's voice calling her name. She turned around and at first thought that it must be the Skin Man, come to take another body part from her. But instead, she saw someone she recognized. It was Derek, his cheeks flushed from the effort of running and sweat beading on his brow. He stopped to catch his breath in front of her.
I'm so glad you're all right. When I saw you enter the Black Lane, I thought...
He looked down at the ragged stump of her left arm.
What happened? Did something... Are you...
I lost a hand, Derek, that's all. I haven't been tainted by the darkness and transformed into some horrible fiend. As those words left her mouth, she wondered how much truth was in them. She had no idea what the Skin Man had done to her while she was unconscious.
After you left the crossroads, I closed up my stall and followed you. Once I realized the direction you were heading in, I became concerned for your safety. The streets near the Black Lanes are dangerous enough, but to enter the place itself, I thought you might need some assistance.
Oh, how gallant of you. But you didn't follow me into the Black Lane, did you? You stopped well before that. Derek remained silent. And I wager you were less interested in helping me than you were catching up to me and doing what you've only fantasized about until now. Again, silence. Only now, his cheeks reddened in embarrassment or anger. Perhaps some of both. What did you do when you saw me enter the Black Lane? Did you wait around, hoping that when I returned, if I returned, you could play the concerned would-be suitor and get into my good graces? Or did you hope that when I returned, I wouldn't be in the right mind and I'd be defenseless against your advances? Suddenly, and without warning, Derek backhanded her across the face. She stumbled, but she didn't fall to the ground. The pain was nothing compared to what the Skin Man had done.
You think you're so much better than me. You and Cole both. I barely made a profit off of the useless junk your husband brought me to sell. There was only ever one thing he had that I truly wanted. You. That's why I suggested Cole try scavenging in the Black Lanes. I figured at worst, he might bring me something worthy of buying for a change. And at best, something nasty would catch hold of him, and he'd never return. I've wanted you for so long, and when you approached my stall today, I decided to seize the moment.
He stepped forward and grabbed her left arm with a look of disgust.
An unfortunate flaw, but one that can be overlooked, assuming that all of your other parts are intact.
With his free hand, he reached out for her throat, grabbing it and choking her. If she didn't act fast, she would slip into unconsciousness, so she did what she had to. She reached into her pocket with her right hand, wrapped her fingers around the shard of metal, and rammed it into his gut. He cried out in pain, stepping back and releasing his grip. He looked down at the weapon in her hand, and then the widening crimson stain on his shirt. A puzzled yet furious expression played across his face. He lunged at her, but before he could get a hold of her, she swept out with the knife, a single arc that tore open his throat. Blood poured from the new wound, and he reached up with both hands in a desperate, if futile, attempt to stop the bleeding. He looked into her eyes, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth as if trying to say something, but all that came out was more blood. He stumbled and collapsed to the ground, laying motionless, his eyes wide and staring off into the distance. Some time passes, and we find Marceline back at the steps of the abandoned building in the Black Lanes. She had dragged Derek's body all the way here and was offering it to the Skin Man. The creature crawled out of the darkness, his gaze drifting down to the corpse with a look of dissatisfaction.
A waste of perfectly good blood, but he'll do.
A jagged, undulating tendril extruded from underneath the Skin Man's cloak and snaked its way across the ground, wrapping itself around the dead man's ankle. He turned and made his way back into the darkness of the abandoned building, dragging Derek's body along with him. As he faded back into the shadows, she heard his voice one final time.
Go home and await your husband's return.
She turned to leave, and as she walked away, she listened to the terrible sounds coming from inside the Skin Man's domain, the tearing of flesh from bone and the wet sound of organs being plucked from a body cavity. She never looked back. When she made it back to her home, she found her 2 children sound asleep at the table. They had been through a lot over the last 6 days and must have been incredibly worried about their father. As she scooped them up and took them to bed, and when morning came, the children awoke to something they hadn't smelled in a long time. A hot breakfast. Marceline was in the kitchen cooking. She felt that the children needed this, and hot meals were a rarity in Lowtown. And most of the time, they lived off of cold gruel and dry rations. The children ran to her side, throwing their arms around her. They told her that they were so worried, that they thought she would disappear just like their father had. Their joy turned into immediate horror, however, when they saw their mother's arm. She told them not to worry, that it wasn't really as bad as it looked, and that she would get used to it. She smiled and told them that she had great news, that their father would be coming home. No sooner had those words left her lips than the front door began to creak open. A huge smile spread across her face, and she turned to see a familiar silhouette in the doorframe. Her heart filling with joy, near to bursting, the Skin Man had kept his promise. Cole was finally home. Cole stepped across the threshold of their home, and for the first time in almost a week, she got a really good look at him. This was no doubt the man that she had raised a family with, but he had changed. His flesh was pale and crisscrossed with seams, much like the Skin Man. His face was like a jigsaw that held no expression whatsoever, and his eyes were like a pair of pale glass orbs that didn't blink. His movements were stiff and unnatural and reminded her of a puppet show she had seen when she was young. And much like those puppets, Cole was like a dead thing, given only the illusion of life by someone else's trickery. The Skin Man had followed through on his promise. He had reassembled Cole, but his ability to do so was far more limited than Marceline had expected. But it didn't matter what he looked like. Families adjusted, they made compromises, and they loved each other unconditionally. She threw her arms around his neck and told him they were so glad that he had come back, but Cole didn't answer. He stumbled past her and moved towards the table, pulling a chair out and dropping it with a heavy thud. He sat down, his face still as a statue. Her youngest daughter tugged on her dress and asked what was wrong with Daddy. Her voice was trembling and afraid. It was then that she heard the Skin Man's voice in her head one final time.
You gave me a corpse, and so I gave you one in return. Fair trade.
All of her instincts were telling her that this was wrong, that this was deeply and terribly wrong. But after everything she had been through, something snapped, and all of the warnings her body was sending her were repressed. They would make this work. The bright light of madness danced in her eyes, and she looked down at her children. Your father has returned. Aren't you going to give him a hug? The children exchanged frightened glances, and Cole's features that had remained slack and unmoving ever since his arrival stretched into a cold, cruel smile. His eyes, however, remained dead and empty. With lightning speed, his arm shot out and wrapped around each of his children, pulling them against his body. Both of the children screamed and writhed, struggling to get free of his grip, but he was too strong, and they began sobbing loudly. Marceline hated seeing her children cry, but she told herself that kids were extremely adaptable. They just needed time to adjust. Everything was going to work out. Everything was okay. She went to her husband's side and draped her handless arm across his shoulder. Breakfast is almost ready, dear. Welcome home. He didn't reply or even acknowledge that she had spoke, but that was all right. As two people who truly and deeply loved each other as much as Cole and Marceline did, didn't need words to communicate. She bent down and kissed his cold, dead lips, and then began humming brightly as she sauntered back to the stove.